Good evening. This week I want to think a little bit about this week's parashah, Tetzei. Earlier this week, in reflection, I examined the different way that we can read a text from the Torah. Sometimes a literal reading allows us to take stories of our ancestors or bits of history and discover important moral lessons, and it also allows for an understanding of basic laws which guide Jewish life. Other times, however, the Torah can be very disturbing, whether in story or law, leaving us scratching our heads wondering what positive or relevant messages these texts can teach. Some texts indeed are so horrifying that we wonder how these texts can be seen as words of the divine. These texts require a reading on a very different level, where the simple meaning either vanishes or indeed is rejected. A fundamental literal meaning many times can not only be horrifying, but also dangerous. Two such texts, with a number of other possible choices, also with horrifying or disturbing messages, can be adduced from this week's parashah. The parashah provides a remedy for stubborn, rebellious teens. It legislates that such teens should be brought by their parents to the city gates, and then, following a very brief and pro forma judicial process, they can be stoned to death. The second set of texts states, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter the congregation of the Eternal. Even their 10th generation shall not enter the congregation for all eternity." These texts elevate values, either the execution of our children or racist exclusions which don't fit most Jews' understanding of the values central to our tradition. It is, however, not only modern Jews that struggle with these texts. 2,000 years ago, the rabbis rejected the literal underlying values and sought ways to make these laws both unenforceable and obsolete. A close reading of the first text eliminated all female children, as the text says sons, so therefore girls should not be included. And logic eliminated nearly all pre- and post-bar mitzvah boys. Thus, this text was made obsolete and inoperable. Historical events were then used to obviate the exclusions found in the second text. The rabbis claimed that these national distinctions of Ammonites and Moabites no longer existed, as the people of the Middle East had been mixed up by the Assyrians. Thus, while the texts perforce remained, as they were part of the written Torah, their enforceability and even relevance was eliminated. It may be asked at this juncture why there is a necessity to leave these texts in the Torah, where they remain, in some sense, the word of the divine, and therefore can still shape the world view of unsophisticated or fundamentalist literalist readers. Well, no one, I believe, would want a Reader's Digest version of the Torah, leaving out the difficult bits. It is essential for me that these texts are taught with all the necessary corrections and explanations, and that they be seen through a continuing layer of Jewish thought, which rejects them and shows how they don't fit in our modern Jewish worldview. The Torah we're taught speaks in the language of man, and was given reflecting a very different world than our own. Interpretations must be built on our newer realities and differing understandings of Torah values. As we find ourselves in Elul, a month of preparation for the holy days, there can also be a deeper mystical understanding of some of the texts from Tetzei, including that of the stubborn and rebellious child, which are germane to this liturgical season of repentance. Rather than speaking of the mundane world, the physical world in which we live, These texts, from a mystical perspective, can be seen as struggles within each of us, especially at times when we focus on repentance as judgment approaches. The parashah begins with the following words, "When you go out to war." Well, this verse reflects the historical reality of ancient Israel. We're taught that on a deeper level, it refers to the struggle within our souls to make the choices of our lives. In the terms of the rabbis, the struggle between the Yetzer HaTov, the inclination for good, and the Yetzer Hara, the inclination for evil. Our material world allows us free choice to follow or also not to follow God's ways. Often the temptation to fulfill our gratuitous needs at the expense of a life of care and compassion for others seems more than we can overwhelm. Yet, the struggle continues, and tshuva, repentance, is always possible. Within this context, the stubborn and rebellious teen is not an external child, but instead should be interpreted as our Yetzer Hara, our inclination for evil. When we recognize it, and especially when we recognize the mistakes we have made in our lives, then the challenge is to reveal it, and then through a process of reconciliation and apology to God, and even more importantly to other human beings, to remove its negativity, to stone it, in other words, permanently from our souls. These steps of tshuva ideally should mark not only this period, but every day in our lives. The same message of spiritual transformation also is found at the very end of Tetzei, our parashah. The Torah reminds us of a historical struggle between the Amalekites, who become the symbol for the rabbis and indeed for the Torah of evil. Within the text, we're told to blot out the memory of Amalek from the world. Within our souls, within a mystical understanding of this text, our personal spiritual lives, this teaching is a reminder that each of us, no matter how holy we think we are, needs to engage in a continuous process of purification, realizing that the Yetzer Hara, the temptation to do evil, the temptation not to work for the betterment of the world and for humanity, may always be present. We need to make changes. We need to blot this out as we make ourselves better human beings and work for the betterment of the world. Shabbat Shalom.